Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentor and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic out there. Today on the podcast, guys, we're going to be talking about the Fasten Seatbelt sign. You know that signs that come on with a little sign about fastening your seatbelt? Well, everyone thinks that they know how this works, but there's actually quite a lot too when we put that sign on and off, all right? So stay tuned. I'm going to give you all of the little insights here, and I think you're going to love this one. Right guys, so the Fasten Seatbelt sign. So everyone obviously associates the seatbelt sign with turbulence, all right? But the Fasten Seatbelt sign has many uses, and obviously the primary reason that it's there is for the flight crew to be able to communicate to both the cabin crew and to the passengers that passengers need to be sitting down and put the seatbelt sign on, okay? On the ground, it has a specific purpose, and you might have noticed sometimes when you board an aircraft that the Fasten Seatbelt sign is not on, and then all of a sudden you hear the bing and the seatbelt sign comes on. All right, that has to do with if the aircraft is being fueled or not. So there are some very strict rules for when we as flight crew can be fueling the aircraft and boarding passengers at the same time. Some of the rules includes that we need to have at least one cabin crew on board for each 50 passengers. Okay, so normally speaking there is 3 cabin crew on board, but then as the 150th passenger is coming on board, well then the 4th cabin crew has to come on board as well to make sure that there's enough emergency exits being manned in case of a sudden evacuation. Another rule is that there needs to be a person outside monitoring the fueling. Now this can be a trained dispatcher or in my company it has to be either an engineer or a pilot, okay? So that tends to be the pilot monitoring who is doing his or her walk around, and while we're fueling and boarding they will be outside and connected through a headset looking at the fueler, so that if there would be a fuel leak or there would be a fire somewhere close to the aircraft or something like that, that information can quickly be relayed up to the pilot flying, who can then initiate either stopping the boarding and turning the passengers back or initiate an evacuation if it's really needed. So the seatbelt sign will be off during this entire period. As long as the aircraft is being fueled, the seatbelt sign has to be off to indicate to the cabin crew that fueling is still going on, and also to make sure that the passengers haven't got their seatbelts on in case they quickly have to evacuate. So on the ground, that's what we use the seatbelt sign on. So when you hear the bing and the belts coming on, that basically means that the fueling is finished. Then the seatbelt sign is going to be on during the initial part, obviously, when we are pushing back, starting up our engines, when we're taxiing out and taking off, because we need the passengers to be seated and listen to the cabin crew during that phase of flight. Now, somewhere during the climb, we will want to release the passengers so that you can go to the toilets and move around in the cabin. The first thing we will do tends to be to release the cabin crew. And we will do that by the cabin crew call button. So we call them, and that call doesn't mean that we need to be in contact with them. This first call means that they are released to start their service. Which means that if we actually need to talk to them, we have to remember that we ding them once and then wait a little while and we ding them again, or we call number 1 to the flight deck if it's something that is really urgent. But that's what we do. So we first release the cabin crew to let them start working, and then at around 10,000 feet, providing that there is no turbulence forecasted and the weather around the aircraft looks okay, then we release the passengers. And we do that by putting the fasten belt not to off but to auto. And the reason that we put it to auto is because if we would forget to put the belts on again during the descent, which we shouldn't because there are checklists to check this, but then once the gear comes down or the flaps come out, the fasten belts would come out automatically. All right. Anyway, so during the climb then, passengers are free to move around, use the toilets and so on. Now, if we encounter turbulence, the first thing that we are supposed to do is put the belts on, because we need to protect our passengers. And we will do that even when we see that there's a possibility of turbulence coming up ahead. So for example, we see that we are getting closer to a thunderstorm, for example. Obviously, we are going to try to avoid it, but we might be in the vicinity of it, and that might be turbulence associated with it. Well, in that case, we turn the belts on in kind of anticipation of the turbulence to come. Also, if we're getting reports from air traffic control that aircraft ahead of us has experienced turbulence, we will put it on, because we realize that passengers might be moving around in the cabin, and just because we put the belts on doesn't mean that they automatically immediately sit down. They need to get a little bit of a heads up. And it also goes for the cabin crew. They know that when it comes on, that is about to happen. Now, turbulence. This is interesting because we have 3 grades of turbulence. You have light turbulence, moderate turbulence, and severe turbulence. For all 3 of these, we need the belts to be on. However, we always have light turbulence. Like the aircraft in itself is moving around in the air, and there will be a little bit of chops. You will feel the aircraft kind of moving. So the question then becomes, when do we put the belts on? Because we cannot have it on all the time. Now, this is going to be up to the pilot flying or the commander of the aircraft to when they want to put the belts on. We all have our own little techniques. Me, myself, I try to envisage myself with a cup of coffee in my hand, not surprisingly. Whenever I think that the turbulence is bad enough for me to have problems to keep that cup of coffee without kind of spilling, well, then the turbulence is bad enough to put the belts on. Because it's likely that people will then have problems moving in a straight line down the cabin. There might be risks of serving hot drinks, things like that. So whenever I go past that point, I always put the belts on. Prior to that, if it's just very, very light turbulence, I keep the belts off. Then, of course, for moderate and severe turbulence, you have to put the belts on. And also, if the turbulence becomes very bad, I will also make a call to the cabin crew saying, cabin crew, take your stations. All right. That means that the cabin crew will stop their service, store their trolleys, and sit down and wait for me to release them again. Now, the cabin crew has the authority to do this by themselves. If they feel that the work is too complicated because of turbulence, they will store their trolleys and sit down by their own accord. But I can also make that call for them. Right, so that's during the cruise. There are some other safety-related times where we might use the seatbelt sign, but I'm not allowed to talk to them because it has to do with safety and security. But basically, the next time we're going to put the belts on is prior to landing. Now, this differs in different airlines. The long-haul airlines tend to put the belts on just before top of descent and keep it on for the entire descent. In short haul and medium haul, we don't do that. So in my airline, we put the belts on when it's 15 minutes left to landing or when we're descending through 15,000 feet. Okay, so whichever one of those comes first, we put the belts on. So we're monitoring. We know approximately what landing time will be, and we'll put the belts on in accordance. Because the cabin crew will need those 15 minutes to make sure that everyone is safely seated, to make their toilet checks, to make sure that the entire cabin is secure. So that when we give them 10 minutes to landing, then they're basically just storing the last couple of parts in the galleys, and they're giving us cabin secure. So we know that the cabin is safe to land. If we haven't got cabin secure before we start our approach, we're going to have to call them, see what the problem is, and obviously abort the approach or landing if the cabin is not secure. And that might be because someone is refusing to sit down or something like that. In that case, we will go into holding. I would give a PA to the passengers, telling them to please follow the instructions of the cabin crew until we're absolutely sure that everyone is seated and the cabin is secure for landing, and we will initiate our approach and land. So the seatbelt sign then stays on until we taxi in onto gate and we get ground power connected, or APU connected, so that we can shut down the engines. We have to have the seatbelt sign on until the engines are shut down. Okay, so that's when you will probably see the flickering of the lights as we're turning on the APU generator or the ground power generator. And then you'll hear how the engines spool down, and then you'll hear cabin crew disarm slides and open doors. All right, that's the sign that the engines are shut down, that it's safe to start to disembark the passengers. And that's how we use the seatbelt sign. So as you see, there is much more to it than only a little bit of turbulence. Okay, there's always, in this world, there's always procedures surrounding every single thing you see. So next time that you hear that ding of the seatbelts coming on, first of all, always follow it, because it's there for the safety and protection of you as a passenger. And also, have a look around, see what's going on. It might be a sign of something going on. Guys, I hope you like this podcast. I am still working on the flaps program. I'm missing some of the videos for it, so the flaps episode will be coming out very, very soon. But up until then, have an absolutely fantastic day. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.